In moments of intense pressure, whether standing at the edge of a cliff, facing a hostile crowd, or making a split-second decision on a battlefield in a courtroom or during an argument, the human brain becomes a neurological emergency room. Within milliseconds, the body is flooded with signals, hormones, and reflexes, initiating a sequence of deeply embedded survival mechanisms. This transformation in mental state is not a metaphor. It is a literal shift in brain activity where ancient neural structures assume control of decision-making, often bypassing relational thought in the process. Understanding this neural battlefield is not merely a concern for neuroscientists or psychologists. It has profound implications for everyone, from first responders and military personnel to athletes, executives, and recovering addicts. Decision-making under pressure is a human experience. To comprehend how and why we act the way we do in moments of stress, we must begin with the brain's primal architecture. At the core of the brain's pressure response system lies a small almond-shaped cluster of neurons called the amygdala. Buried deep within the limbic system, the region associated with emotion, memory, and survival, the amygdala functions as an early warning system. It scans all incoming sensory data for signs of threat long before we become consciously aware of what we're perceiving. When pressure arises, especially if it's associated with potential danger or emotional threat, the amygdala is among the first structures to respond. It assesses risk based on past experiences, learned fear, and biological sensitivity, and if a perceived threat is detected, it triggers a cascade of responses, the now familiar fight, flight, freeze or fawn mechanisms. This is not a deliberate decision. It's an automatic reaction rooted in evolutionary biology and honed over millennia of survival challenges. The amygdala's influence is profound because it acts faster than the brain's higher order reasoning centers. It is a first responder, and as such, it often overrides more measured, rational processes in favor of speed and protection. When the amygdala perceives a threat, whether physical, emotional, or social, it communicates immediately with the hypothalamus, which in turn signals the autonomic nervous system to activate the sympathetic branch. This activation results in the rapid release of stress hormones, primarily adrenaline, epinephrine, or cortisol, preparing the body to respond to danger. Simultaneously, sensory input such as visual, auditory, or tactile stimuli is routed through the thalamus, the brain's relay station. Under normal conditions, the thalamus directs information to the prefrontal cortex, where logical analysis and conscious decision-making take place. But under pressure, the brain shortcuts this path. Instead, information is sent directly from the thalamus to the amygdala, enabling what neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux calls a low-road response, fast, reflective, and largely unconscious. This bypass may be life-saving in moments of physical danger, for example, when swerving to avoid a car accident. However, in complex social or moral situations, the absence of prefrontal input can lead to impulsive, poorly reasoned decisions. The very system that evolved to ensure our physical survival may paradoxically undermine our psychological and social well-being in modern contexts. In short, high-stakes decision-making activates a specialized neurological cascade, one that prioritizes speed and survival over nuance and foresight. By understanding this cascade and especially the role of amygdala in bypassing higher-order thinking, we gain critical thinking insight into why even highly trained individuals can act irrationally under pressure. More importantly, it lays the groundwork for exploring how we might train the brain to regain cognitive control, even in the heat of the moment, a topic I'm going to address in later sections. The human brain is capable of remarkable logic, creativity, and foresight, but under intense pressure, these capabilities can be temporarily suspended. In such moments, emotional processing overrides rational thought, leading to what psychologist Daniel Goleman famously termed the amygdala hijack. This phenomenon describes the way intense emotional arousal, particularly fear, anger, or panic, can disrupt normal cognitive functioning, effectively placing instinct in the driver's seat. The amygdala hijack is not merely a metaphor, it's a measurable neurobiological event with significant implications for decision-making, behavior, and safety. Under typical low-stress conditions, the prefrontal cortex, located at the front of the brain, is responsible for executive functions such as reasoning, impulse control, problem-solving, and social judgment. It evaluates consequences, weighs risks, and plans actions. However, in moments of high emotional intensity, especially under threat or perceived danger, the amygdala activates more rapidly than the prefrontal cortex. And as I described earlier, this leads to the neural shortcut in which sensory data is diverted from the thalamus directly to the amygdala, bypassing the slower, more deliberate prefrontal pathways. The result is that emotional impulses may erupt before reason has time to intervene. One may lash out, run, freeze, or make reckless decisions, not because of poor character or lack of training, but because the rational brain has been temporarily overruled by an evolutionary survival mechanism. Here are a few real-world examples of amygdala hijack. 1. First responders in crisis. Firefighters entering a burning building must suppress the amygdala's panic signal to flee. Yet, even among trained professionals, instances occur where a flashover or unexpected structural collapse can trigger a momentary freeze or retreat, a classic example of the amygdala hijack, especially in newer recruits whose prefrontal resilience hasn't fully matured under pressure. 2. Athletes in high-stakes moments. In sports psychology, the term choking is often attributed to performance anxiety, but neurologically, it's often an amygdala hijack, where fear of failure, public scrutiny, or momentary panic disrupts coordination and fluid decision-making. This explains why elite athletes sometimes miss routine plays under extreme spotlight, despite countless hours of preparation. Number 3. Everyday human conflict. Imagine a parent who yells uncontrollably at their child in the supermarket, only to regret it moments later, or someone sending an impulsive, hurtful text during an argument. These are not necessarily acts of conscious cruelty. They are reflexive reactions driven by emotional flooding, where the amygdala temporarily seizes control of behavior. In each case, what's being observed is not a character flaw, it is the neurological signature of acute stress. While fight or flight are commonly recognized survival reactions, freeze is less understood, yet equally significant. The freeze response occurs when neither fighting or fleeing is perceived as viable, particularly in scenarios where danger is overwhelming, inescapable, or sudden. Neurobiologically, freezing is driven by overactivation of the dorsal vagal complex of the parasympathetic nervous system, part of the brainstem circuitry involved in energy conservation and shutdown. This results in a kind of functional immobility. Heart rate slows, awareness narrows, limbs may lock, and vocalization may be inhibited. Far from being a sign of passivity or cowardice, the freeze response is an adaptive defense strategy, one often seen in animals playing dead, or in humans during assault, trauma, or sudden catastrophe. For many survivors of trauma, especially those who are unable to resist or escape, the freeze response becomes embedded as a default survival mode. In high-stress decision-making environments, freezing can emerge in subtle ways: a momentary hesitation before reacting, an inability to speak up under pressure, or even a total blanking out of options. In each instance, the brain is prioritizing survival over performance, often to the bewilderment or frustration of the individual involved. The amygdala hijack, in all its forms, fight, flight, or freeze, reveals a profound truth. When the brain perceives danger, instinct outruns intellect. Understanding this dynamic is not only essential for self-awareness, it's critical for anyone seeking to perform well under pressure, lead others through crisis, or recover from past trauma. In the theater of high-stakes decision-making, the prefrontal cortex plays the role of the inner strategist. This region, located at the very front of the brain, is responsible for a suite of higher-order cognitive functions: judgment, impulse control, planning, self-awareness, and the ability to anticipate consequences. But under acute stress, even this sophisticated system can be compromised, overwhelmed by emotional intensity and biochemical changes that alter its ability to function effectively. Once the immediate threat signal has been triggered by the amygdala and the sympathetic nervous system is in full activation, the brain does remain indefinitely in a reactive state. In many cases, the prefrontal cortex attempts to reassert control, especially as the situation stabilizes or the individual has learned to regulate their stress response. This re-engagement process involves executive functioning, evaluating the available options, predicting potential outcomes, analyzing risk versus reward, and ultimately choosing a course of action. This These are cognitively demanding tasks that require oxygen, glucose, and calmness of the central nervous system, all of which are in limited supply when adrenaline and cortisol are flooding the body. Stress hormones, particularly cortisol, are known to temporarily impair synaptic activity in the prefrontal cortex. This is a protective feature in survival situations. It helps the body avoid overthinking when immediate action is needed. However, in modern day scenarios where thoughtful decisions are often critical, for example, emergency medical decisions, courtroom arguments, parenting under stress, this override can be counterproductive. In effect, under stress, the brain shifts from deliberation to reaction. While this may enhance speed, it often reduces precision and foresight, leading to mistakes, poor judgment, and emotionally driven decisions that the individual may regret once the stress subsides. One of the most vulnerable aspects of cognition under pressure is working memory, the brain's capacity to hold, manipulate, and process multiple pieces of information in real time. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for this functionality, and it's highly sensitive to stress. When cortisol levels rise, neuronal efficiency in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex declines, which means that working memory becomes fragmented or degraded. This explains why in moments of pressure, people may forget critical steps in a familiar process, mix up details, or struggle to follow instructions, not due to incompetence, but because the cognitive architecture supporting memory and sequencing is being biochemically suppressed. This degradation becomes particularly evident in multitasking environments. For example, a paramedic trying to recall medication dosages during a chaotic rescue, a student freezing mid-exam forgetting information they had previously mastered. We can all relate to that. A parent trying to reason with a child while simultaneously fielding a call from work. In each scenario, the bandwidth for complex cognitive processing is narrowed. The result is not just mental fatigue, but a measurable decline in decision quality. Despite these psychological limitations, the brain is highly adaptable, and certain individuals demonstrate remarkable ability to maintain prefrontal functioning even in high-pressure environments. How is this possible? The answer lies in neuroplasticity, the brain's capacity to rewire itself through repetition and experience. When individuals undergo systematic training and simulation, they build stronger, more efficient neural pathways that allow the prefrontal cortex to remain engaged even under stress. This is particularly evident in elite athletes who rehearse high-pressure plays repeatedly, embedding responses into procedural memory. Surgeons who practice emergency scenarios until critical thinking becomes automatic. Military and law enforcement personnel who use stress inoculation training to condition their nervous system to maintain executive control under duress. So what training does neurologically is reduce the brain's reliance on fragile working memory, shifting decision making into more automatic and resilient circuits. It doesn't eliminate stress, it increases the brain's tolerance for it, allowing the prefrontal cortex to operate under conditions that would normally provoke a full amygdala hijack in an untrained individual. This is not a cognitive advantage, but a biological adaptation, one that can be cultivated with discipline, structure, and repetition. In short, the prefrontal cortex is the brain's executive, rational, and strategic center, which is aware of long-term consequences. But under pressure, it's vulnerable to emotional override and chemical interference. With training and intentional design, however, it can become more resistant to stress, a crucial step in improving decision-making when the stakes are high. Decision-making under pressure is not purely a function of conscious willpower or mental discipline. It is profoundly shaped by the neurochemical environment within the brain. In high-stress scenarios, a complex interplay of neurotransmitters and hormones, particularly adrenaline, dopamine, serotonin, and cortisol, dramatically influences how we evaluate risks, process emotions, and select behavioral responses. Understanding the roles of these neurochemicals is essential to grasp how decision-making becomes either sharp or compromised in high-pressure contexts. These substances do not simply enhance or inhibit brain activity, they redirect attention, prioritize certain information over others, and alter the perceived value of potential outcomes. When a high-stakes situation arises, the initial response often involves a surge of adrenaline, epinephrine, released by the adrenal medulla as part of the sympathoadrenal response. Adrenaline's primary purpose is to mobilize energy and prepare the body for immediate action. Increased heart rate, dilated pupils, rapid respiration, and redirected blood flow toward muscles. From a cognitive standpoint, it enhances alertness and focuses attention narrowly on the perceived threat. At the same time, the brain's dopaminergic system, especially circuits within the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens, becomes highly active. Dopamine is traditionally associated with pleasure and reward, but in pressure situations, it plays a more nuanced role, motivating action by increasing the perceived value of success and simultaneously heightening the emotional weight of potential failure. In other words, dopamine amplifies the stakes. Under pressure, even routine decisions may feel high risk because the dopamine system intensifies the reward prediction error, the gap between expected and actual outcomes. This can lead to impulsivity, especially when coupled with an overactive amygdala and suppressed prefrontal control, as I discussed in prior sections. Interestingly, dopamine's role in decision making is context dependent. In individuals with prior exposure to risk, training, or success under pressure, dopamine may reinforce confidence and goal-directed behavior. In contrast, in those with little experience or heightened sensitivity to stress, it may drive reckless choices or an inability to disengage from high reward but low probability options. While adrenaline and dopamine fuel action and urgency, serotonin serves as a stabilizing force, modulating mood, emotional resilience, and impulse control. Originating primarily from the raphe nuclei in the brainstem, serotonin acts as a neuromodulator that influences multiple systems across the brain, including the limbic system and prefrontal cortex. Under normal conditions, adequate serotonin levels help individuals regulate their emotional responses, maintain optimism, and recover from stress. But under sustained pressure or in individuals predisposed to anxiety or depression, serotonin levels can drop, impairing the brain's ability to filter emotional noise, maintain perspective, or recover composure after a mistake. Low serotonin is particularly implicated in rumination and emotional rigidity, the tendency to loop on negative thoughts or become locked in to a singular emotional response. In decision-making contexts, this may manifest as emotional flooding, indecisiveness, or spiraling after a perceived failure or threat. So, serotonin plays a crucial role in helping the brain navigate the emotional intensity of high-pressure moments, allowing the individual to remain flexible, grounded, and open to complex evaluations rather than reverting to binary win-lose good-bad thinking. Perhaps the most well-known neurochemical associated with stress is cortisol, a glucocorticoid hormone released by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Cortisol is essential for short-term survival. It increases glucose availability, enhances blood flow to critical organs, and modulates immune responses. But in high-pressure decision-making, excessive or prolonged cortisol presents a unique challenge. In the short term, cortisol impairs neuroplasticity, particularly in the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory consolidation, and prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and regulation. The effect is a dramatic narrowing of attention, often referred to as tunnel vision. This phenomenon has been observed in clinical, military, and emergency response settings, where individuals under intense pressure become hyper-focused on a singular threat or task, to the exclusion of equally important variables. This may help explain why pilots, surgeons, or law enforcement officers can sometimes overlook obvious information in crisis situations. Moreover, chronic cortisol exposure depletes brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a key protein involved in learning and adaptability. Over time, this biochemical erosion can lead to burnout, cognitive fatigue, and compromised executive function, particularly in high responsibility professions. The irony is stark. The very hormone designed to help the brain survive stress can, if unregulated, degrade the brain's ability to make quality decisions, especially in environments that demand clarity, creativity, and emotional regulation. So, the brain under pressure becomes a neurochemical symphony, with each transmitter and hormone altering the speed, clarity, and direction of thought. While adrenaline and dopamine push the brain toward urgent action, serotonin provides emotional balance, and cortisol introduces the risk of cognitive collapse. Together, they define the quality and outcome of every decision made in high-stress conditions. While much of the neuroscience of decision-making under pressure highlights the limitations and vulnerabilities of the human brain, the story does not end there. One of the most remarkable features of the brain is its neuroplasticity, its capacity to change structure and function in response to experience, training, and intentional effort. This means that the ability to perform well under pressure is not simply a trait one is born with, but a skill that can be cultivated. Through consistent practice, cognitive rehearsals, and behavioral conditioning, individuals can strengthen the neural pathways that promote clarity, composure, and strategic thinking, even in high-stress environments. One of the most effective ways to interrupt the amygdala hijack and bring the prefrontal cortex back online is through conscious regulation of the breath. Controlled breathing, specifically slow, deep, diaphragmatic breathing, has been shown in numerous studies to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, particularly the vagus nerve, which plays a central role in emotional and psychological regulation. Breath control exerts bottom-up effect on the brain. By slowing the breath, individuals can decrease heart rate variability, reduce cortisol levels, and dampen amygdala reactivity, creating psychological conditions that allow the prefrontal cortex to regain its regulatory role. Neuroimaging research has confirmed that mindfulness-based practices such as breath-focused meditation and body scans increase activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex while simultaneously reducing activity in the amygdala. For example, a study published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience in 2010 found that as little as 8 weeks of mindfulness training led to measurable changes in gray matter density in brain regions associated with learning, memory, emotional regulation, and perspective taking. Mindfulness, then, is not just a psychological or spiritual technique. It's a neurological intervention that enhances decision making by rebalancing the emotional and executive networks. For high-performance professions, from athletes to surgeons to military leaders, even brief mindfulness practices before or during high-pressure events can yield significant improvements in outcomes. Another powerful tool for building resilience and foresight under pressure is pre-mortem analysis, a technique that involves imagining that a decision or plan has failed, and then working backward to determine what could lead to that failure. Unlike post-mortem reflections, which occur after an outcome is known, the pre-mortem primes the brain to anticipate risk before it materializes. From a neuroscientific perspective, this technique activates mental simulation circuits in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus areas responsible for future planning, contextual reasoning, and memory retrieval. By visualizing adverse outcomes in advance, individuals build cognitive maps that can be rapidly assessed in the moments of stress, reducing reaction time and improving decision quality. Scenario planning operates on a similar principle. Exposing the brain to a range of plausible futures enhances cognitive flexibility, allowing decision makers to shift gears more easily when pressure alters the original plan. These strategies train the brain to view uncertainty not as chaos, but as manageable variation. Both methods are widely used in military training, corporate risk management, and elite sports, precisely because they leverage neural preparedness. In high-pressure scenarios, the mind does not always rise to the occasion. It often falls back on its training. Pre-mortem and scenario-based thinking ensure that what it falls back on is robust, rehearsed, and rational. While much of the literature on pressure emphasizes its detrimental effects, it's important to acknowledge that pressure is not inherently harmful. In fact, moderate levels of stress, known in neuroscience as eustress, can enhance performance, sharpen focus, and improve memory. The key difference lies in perception and preparation. When individuals interpret pressure as a threat, the brain initiates a defensive posture, activating survival circuits that end the rational thought. But when pressure is interpreted as a challenge, the same psychological responses can fuel motivation, confidence, and adaptive action. This reframing, turning pressure into a catalyst rather than a crisis, is not just a mindset shift, it's a neurological shift, reinforced through repeated exposure, internal narrative, and training. Understanding how the brain works under pressure empowers individuals to move from reactivity to resilience. With knowledge of the neural systems at play and the tools to influence them, anyone can improve their decision making under stress. The neuroscience of decision-making under pressure reveals a delicate balance between instinct and strategy, emotion and logic, reaction and intention. While the brain's default wiring often favors survival-based responses, we are not in the face of pressure. Through techniques such as mindful breathing, cognitive simulation, and structured scenario planning, we can strengthen the circuits that promote clarity, regulation, and intelligent action, even when the stakes are high. In the end, peak performance is not the absence of pressure, but the ability to operate wisely and decisively within it.